Hello there, my name is Kay Byfield, and this is your ArtSpeaks studio moment from ArtSpeaks Studio in Dallas, Texas. And today we're going to talk about water and the properties of water and the importance of water for watercolor painters, because the water and controlling the water is the essential aspect for watercolor. So when students first take a watercolor class, the first concern they have is, how much water do I use? And I confess that the real solution to that problem is just practice and paying attention to the surface of the paper. But I'm going to give you a short primer showing you how the water affects the paint. In order to paint with watercolor paint, the artist squeezes some paint out of the tube into the palette or onto the surface that they're using as a mixing space, and then adds water to it. And as you dilute the paint, that makes the paint able to be applied to the surface. So let me show you. Okay, so here's my example. There's paint squeezed from the tubes in the wells of the palette. I take some paint out of the well and I add some water to it, and I make what I call a puddle. And when the puddle is the consistency that I want, which means that it flows, but it isn't pasty, because I want it fairly dark, then I begin to apply the paint to the shape on the paper. As you can see here, as I apply the paint to dry paper, the paint stays in the area that I have painted. But if we have wet paper, so I'm going to paint the whole surface, cover the whole surface with a lot of water, then we see the paint go on completely differently. So now the rectangle is saturated with water, and if I look at it from the side, I can see the glisten in the lights. It's very wet. So look what happens when I apply my paints to this. As you can see, the paint fuzzes out and it dilutes it some. It's not as dark as when we painted on dry paper. So let me finish the other two shapes. As you can see, we get these very soft-edged, nebulous shapes, but we can't control them. They don't have any real form. They just kind of like clouds and wisps, they go away. And if they overlapped one another, they would run into each other and make different colors. This is really useful if you're doing soft things, or for an underpainting perhaps, where you have a fuzzy, out of focus background. But it isn't useful for most things. There was just too much water on the paper. It was too saturated. Now this time I'm wetting the paper just like I did in my second example, but this time I'm not going to let the paper be quite so wet. I'm going to let it dry a bit before I begin applying the paint. So the paper has been wetted within that rectangle, and it is still quite damp, but it isn't glistening wet like it was before. So let's see what a difference that makes. We still have fuzzy edges, but not as fuzzy. The other thing that I'm noticing is, one, the paint goes on with harder edges as the paper continues to dry. See, here it was still quite wet. Here it was pretty wet. here on the top part of the yellow circle, it was pretty wet, but over here it was beginning to dry quite a bit. And as I painted the blue shape, you can see it held that edge pretty well because it was beginning to get pretty dry, but it's still quite damp. Okay, so what I found was that the paint went on easier if the inside of the shape was wet, but the edges fuzzed. So this time I'm going to wet the shape itself, but not outside the shape, so that I can hold a hard edge. So here the paint is running within the shape, but the edge of the shape is staying crisp. And it's a lot easier to paint. So here, the edges are staying crisp, but the inside flowed more freely, and so it was a lot easier to paint. The coverage is smoother, and we got it covered more quickly. Then if I still want soft edges, I can take a different brush, doesn't need to be a flat brush, and I can just run it along the outside edge while the paint is still damp. And that will soften the edge. And so that's the way I do paint quite a lot. If I want the edges to be not quite crisp, but I don't want them going all over the world, then I just use a soft brush afterward and soften them. That the quality of the edges is determined by whether or not the edges of the shape can move into wet areas, either by pre-wetting the paper and then paint very fuzzy, not controlled shape, or you go back and you wet the edges again after the paper is beginning to dry, but when the shape is still damp, and that will allow the shape to expand. So these are fairly large shapes, and the other big problem we have with water when we paint in watercolor in terms of the way it affects the quality of the paint on the surface is that if we keep applying paint as parts of the shape are beginning to dry, we will see the new paint and new water will impact the old paint. So for instance, I've got this red shape. So I've allowed the water to dry. And what we see is that the paint that I applied at the beginning, and it's still quite damp, the paint that I applied at the beginning had begun to dry, and the paint that was applied later is wet, and it ran back a bit and made an uneven surface right there. You can particularly see it right here in the blue. So the paint down here was wetter, the paint up here was beginning to dry, and so the wet paint ran back into the dry. It's not a very pronounced example, but it's what we call a run back. Sometimes we want run backs. A lot of times we don't want them, especially we don't want them because they create shapes where we may not want shapes. But if you do want run backs, let me show you how you do it. Okay, so the surface of the red shape is covered, and now I want some run backs or some balloons or blossoms, they're called many things. I want some of those in this shape to create some texture. So what I can do is I can add a little bit of water with some pigment in it, and I can touch it in a few places. And then I can watch what's going to happen with the paint. Okay, so I hope that you can see that the red is starting to run back upon itself. We're getting a nice hard line right here and a nice edge here, and so forth. And that's really quite attractive, in my opinion. So let's see if we can do this even more consciously with the blue shape. Okay, so the key to creating intentional runbacks is that as the paint is beginning to dry, you need to add fresh paint or fresh water, and you need to watch it and kind of make sure that the shapes that you're creating with the runbacks or balloons or blossoms are interesting and are what you had in mind. So I can see that it's beginning to dry up here. So if I put some paint back in there and I come over here and I add a little bit of paint, I can foster those runbacks as I would like. So let's see what will happen. Okay, so the effect isn't finished yet. It's been sitting here for about 10 minutes and I've been nurturing it along a little bit, adding a little more paint, adding a little bit more water. But you can see that we get this really nice effect within the red shape, and we're starting to get it here in the blue shape. And if that is something that you want to do in your paintings, it's something that is entirely possible. With watercolor, water is everything. It takes time to learn how to control it, but you need to understand that if you apply it first, that does something. If you paint on dry paper, that does something. If you wet your shape inside the shape, that will help the paint move within the shape and you might get more even surfaces. If you continue to add paint as the paint is beginning to dry, that will change the look of the shape as well. So learning how to do these is just practice. But when you do, you can get the most out of your watercolors. So I hope this information has been helpful to you. And until next time, happy painting.